We cultural anthropologists just love to categorize humans and everything we do. We take a morsel of the human experience and we start thinking about how that morsel varies across cultures and history. I mean, it's great fun because with anthropology, you can take something so familiar like family, for example, and then in an instant, you can see it and yourself in a whole new light, right? I mean, on the surface, family, it's so familiar to us that it's literally the base of the word familiar itself. I mean, family, it feels like it's innate or natural. But is it? Today, let's have some fun and see how the anthropological lens can deepen our appreciation of this thing we call family. Consider this to get us started. All across the world, across all known cultures, what's one universal about the way we humans make families? And I promise, there's only one. When I ask this question to my students, they jump right in, you know. Maybe you're thinking what they're thinking. Something about 2 or more people living together? Sure. But wait, my friends in Mali have families where there's more than 2 parents, and to be honest, they'd be rather surprised to hear they're not a family. Then some students, they always mention something like married people co-raising children. But I know plenty of terrific single parents, and I also know great families that don't have any offspring. By this point, it's usually the romantics amongst us that bring up love. Family is a group of people who love each other. And that's nice and all, but again, there's plenty of exceptions to that rule. You know, while I was blessed with a terrific and loving family, I have pals who tell me they just weren't as fortunate. So what is it? What's the one family universal that applies to all cultures across the world? The answer? Well, it's that there is no universal about the way humans make families. I mean, we're all over the place. We do family in all kinds of ways. But with anthropology, we can use our bird's eye view to make sense of this diversity. And today, we'll visit a Malian village, some Tibetan farmers, and even some people in Amazonia, because we need to investigate why different cultures create families in so many different ways. So let's begin with what we know, the nuclear family. Now, the nuclear family is the kind of family we see all over the television, from the Dick Van Dyke Show to Family Guy. And despite the fact that we now see many more non-nuclear families in popular culture and in our daily lives, the nuclear family endures. In its simplest form, a nuclear family consists of 2 parents and their children. And on television, they usually throw in a pet. But if we set the nuclear family as the standard definition for all families, such ethnocentrism will surely lead to our disappointment. Because no matter where you come from, when we see a new or unfamiliar kind of family or marriage, we have something to learn, not fear. And if we follow the methods of Franz Boas and Bronislaw Malinowski, as well as their students, if we embrace cultural relativity, we'll begin to see family and marriage in entirely new ways. Now, the non-nuclear family. Let's think about this. What's a basic difference between early farming families versus 21st century American families? Do early farmers form nuclear families? Well, not exactly. There's plenty of differences here, but there's one big one: unilocal versus neolocal residence. Neo, new location. You see, in industrialized economies like here in the US, we're basically a neolocal residence society. You grow up, you get married, you grab your spouse by the hand, and you both return to your childhood room in your parents' house where you'll live for the rest of your lives, right? Oh, wait a minute. No, that's not what we do at all. When we start a new family, we tend to start a new household and in a new location, separate from our parents. Neolocal residence. Now, we do practice unilocal residence in times of crises, but each generation, for the most part, settles a new home separate from, yet often with some help from parents or other loved ones. But for subsistence farming societies, on the other hand, unilocal residence tends to be the prevailing norm. In the farming community I work with in Mali, males in our village marry females in surrounding villages. And The wedding festivities, they begin when the bride-to-be, her family, and the entire community, as well as a host of drummers, they literally walk her and her belongings to her new home. Now, my younger adoptive brothers, for example, now they have wives and children of their own, but they live in the same compound we've always lived in. Unilocal residence, one family, one residence. So by studying the different ways people make family, we can see that the way you make a living, the way you feed and sustain yourself, well, that significantly influences the way you create and think about your family. Now, my families are great examples. My adoptive Malian family is actually huge, right? Not including me, there's 47 people in the Sangre household, with 4 generations living together. And our collective compound, it's so large that we eat together in about a half a dozen different crews. I mean, it's terrific. I sit down at a common bowl of porridge with my brothers, and as I look over my left shoulder, I see some groups of other family members seated around their common bowls. But we all work together in the same fields and in the same kitchens to put that porridge in our bowls. When I tell people about my Malian family, sometimes they ask why these people living in poverty have such large families. And you know what? From a U.S. perspective, that makes sense. Because over here, life is expensive. And the thought of raising 10 kids through college is enough to frighten most anyone. But over there in Mali, in communities where people eat only what they grow, this logic doesn't hold. Having less children isn't the way to reduce and conserve household resources. Ironically, it's the exact opposite. Curious about this phenomenon, I did a study in Disan, my host village, and I used my census data of all village households along with a farming questionnaire I had completed with each household prior to that growing season. First, in Disan, which is a rural, consumption-based farming community, the mean size of family households was 11. So I split the community into 2. There were those with 11 or more family members, and those with fewer than the mean, 10 or less. I ran the numbers, and I found a significant correlation with household food security and having at least 11 people in your family. Smaller households reported significantly more episodes of food insecurity. It seems that having fewer family members in Disan means you'll have trouble putting food on the table. And I tell you, this does not come as a surprise to Malians. But again, back in the States, where we make our money at work, not by growing it, families I know often struggle just to keep up with the expenses of maybe 1 or 2 kids. Ultimately, the way we make a living, the way we put food on the table, that actually shapes how we make families. So let's dig deeper. Let's do some simulated field research in Asia and South America. But first, we need to see how we anthropologists actually study families. And when it comes to researching family and marriage, anthropologists have a special term we like to use, and that's kinship, right? Influential anthropological minds have been studying kinship since the dawn of our discipline. And even earlier than that. It was proto-anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan, for example. He did anthropological research on family and kinship well before anthropology was even taught in American universities. Morgan, he was fascinated with Native American cultures, and he even lived with the Iroquois for a short time. Native American kinship systems attracted his anthropological eye, and his extensive comparative study across Native American cultures, well, they grew into a much larger project involving cultures from all over the globe. And Morgan argued that kinship is a window into social evolution. So when he sees my host family in Mali with 47 members who collectively work the land, Morgan, he sees more of a primitive form of family from which our so-called modern nuclear family has evolved. Finally, with inspiration from work like Morgan's, early anthropologists were trained to collect kinship data and to theorize on kinship to understand the social structure of traditional societies. And by the 1940s, kinship, it was all the rage amongst anthropologists. So let's take a quick look at a couple of them. First, there's Edward Evans Pritchard, who wrote The Newer based on his fieldwork with this East African pastoralist group. Now, Evans Pritchard studied the social structure and quotidian life of these cattle-oriented people. And he made the general argument that kinship, or the way we do family, is basically a dynamic rule book for social relations, albeit an unwritten one. And it connects us with each other. It defines our relationships with the folks we call family, as well as the rest of the world. And from the interpretivist point of view, anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, well, he was interested in family and kinship in terms of marital-based alliances rather than bloodlines or direct descent. We can put this alliance lens to work again in my Malian host community to get an idea of how our village alliance operates. You see, while men remain in their birth communities, upon marriage, women in Disan leave their birth village to live with their husbands. And similarly, young women in Disan, they leave our community to start families in neighboring villages. So this pattern of marriages, it weaves a thick matrix of long-established family relationships that transform our individual communities into a self-reinforcing and symbiotic cooperative. I remember a heartwarming episode during my dissertation field research, and it's a perfect example of how these alliances mutually sustain their members. As an apprentice to one of my Malian farming teachers, a great man named Bakary Diakité, I refer to him as Chiwara, a mythical local farming hero who first taught humans how to farm grain. Well, Diakité and I, we were alone in his 3-hectare field, and we were planting the whole thing by ourselves and by hand. And in that intense sun, I was struggling. But you know what? I kept on because Bakary had lost all of his field labor that year. He was alone, and he still needed to farm to feed a family of 10. You see, his oldest son, Drissa, he was preparing their fields a month earlier when the family donkey kicked and broke his leg. So there we were, Bakary pressing on like a superhero, and me just trying to help the best I could, but man, I was struggling in that heat and sun. And about 2 hours into the morning, I'll never forget this, I went to the tree where my canteen was hung because I needed some water, and that's where I saw it. It was like a movie. Right there on the far horizon, on the edge of the forest, it was a line of 20 men, all of them with farming tools in hand. And without fuss or fanfare or even a conversation, they had heard about the trouble, and I kid you not, they walked some 7 kilometers to Disan, and they helped us finish our planting in a single day. Now afterwards, we sat under a tree drinking tea and crunching on some peanuts when I asked them, why did you come? They explained to me that despite the fact that they were from a different village, they were one family with Bakary's household through generations of marriage. Now, if you ask me, those are some terrific in-laws. Anyway, collectively, and in many different ways, early kinship-oriented anthropologists, they established the value of kinship as a window into the way different societies organize themselves, including how we make and sustain our families. And with that quick kinship briefing, let's do some virtual field research to discover for ourselves what cross-cultural studies on families can reveal. So first, it's off to Papua New Guinea, where we find cultural anthropologist Bruce Noft. Now, Noft's Gabusi research is a wonderful example of what we're going to do when we try out some virtual ethnographic research in Tibet and Venezuela. Noft, he lived the daily life of the Gabusi, learning terrific lessons all along the way. For example, he once learned a super efficient way to fell trees. The Gabusi, they showed Noft how they only partially chopped down a constellation of trees. But then they completely chopped down one final tree, and remarkably, like falling dominoes, it does the rest of the work lickety-split. Now, more in line with our discussion on family, Noft dedicated a lot of his research to document and explore Gabusi kinship. And as he became more and more familiar with how the Gabusi organized families, he suddenly discovered a connection between local kinship practices and the unusually high local homicide rate. What he found, it wasn't funny, but it does point to a similar yet less extreme ethos we see in US culture back home. It's the dreaded in-laws. You see, as it turns out, when Noft maps out marital relations and local kinship, he can see that if you're looking for the culprit responsible for someone's death, you'd be wise to check out the in-laws as your prime suspects. And not just the mother and father-in-law, all of them. Now, rather than unpacking that compelling conclusion, I'll leave you to do that on your own so we can do some virtual research for ourselves. Let's use our anthropological lens to work out some unique ways that different people form families in the world around us. And for our first virtual ethnographic research mission, we're off to Tibet, where we need to answer our primary research question: why do brothers share a single wife? Think about that. Would you marry someone if you also had to marry all of their siblings? When I ask my students to consider that, some giggle, but most wrench their faces in curious disgust, and they have wide eyes begging for an explanation. You see, some of us may joke about excessively interfering family members, but if you were born into the Limi community in rural Tibet, that's not a joke, it's the norm. Now, rather than writing this cultural practice off, let's use anthropology to work out why these people practice fraternal polyandry. Now, polyandry, that's plural marriage with multiple husbands. So fraternal polyandry is exactly as it sounds: multiple brothers marrying one wife. Why? Now that we're among the Limi of Tibet, I've already facilitated our entry and introduced everyone to our village hosts. These farming families, they're terrific and generous. They greet us warmly, and we quickly embrace the beauty of these people and their community. So let's just get right to work. But wait, what do we do first? Now that we have the elders' permission to do some anthropology field research, well, one of the most noted methodologists in the history of the discipline, Malinowski, he encouraged us to see through these differences and instead seek perspectives that reveal the rational actions and strategies behind what to us outsiders appear as mysterious and exotic practices. So let's do just that with the Limi, family subsistence farmers who have cultivated this challenging, rocky land for generations. And as we get into the participant observation spirit, we work alongside our hosts, preparing the fields for the coming rains. And as we viscerally experience this day-to-day life of a Limi farmer, our hosts tell us how difficult it is to grow food there. You see, they only have limited lands that can produce food, and access to other modes of production like a gig at the local coffee shop or maybe even a shift at the factory, those aren't even options. So the sweat on your brow and the sore back and legs, they're only a small dose of the magnificent effort that these farmers put forth to make sure their families are fed. I mean, it's remarkable. So as we sit in the glow of our solar lantern writing our field observations, we need to write down everything we observed and learned today. But how does this information address our primary research question? Why is it that brothers share a wife? When we asked, our host kept saying that fraternal polyandry, it's just how people do things around here, and that if every brother had a wife, then there'd be way too many kids and just not enough food. So what do you think? Is that a hint? Well, break it down. Talk about it. Talk this out in your field notes. First, we know their adaptation strategy, right? How they make their living and sustain their families. They're subsistence farmers. Yeah, barley farmers who also dabble in animal husbandry. In this village, we saw a lot of sheep and goats. And two, we know that they were really talkative about the extremely difficult growing conditions, including the lack of arable land. And last, their rationale for fraternal polyandry, that it kept birth rates at sustainable levels. And in their words, it prevents having too many kids. I mean, we asked, don't they like raising kids? And they laughed at such a silly question. I mean, they love kids, but they fear having too many. Plus, there's food insecurity. I mean, manual barley farming, limited land, limited inputs and resources, and no real other work to be had in this remote region. You see it, right? Here, in this community, if you want a family and kids, if you want a Limi life right here in rural Tibet, the first thing you have to work out is how to mitigate ridiculously challenging environmental and economic resources. And it turns out that the more we look at this fraternal polyandry from a Limi perspective, the more it begins to make sense. And when we consider our theory further, it cements right into place. Ultimately, with the help of our host community, we not only got a glimpse into their lives, values, and strong work ethic, but we also figured out why fraternal polyandry is the most rational and appropriate local strategy for sustaining life and building a family with new generations to come. I mean, for one, this practice limits reproductive rates to sustainable levels for a place with few resources. Rather than 3 couples producing up to 3 kids every 2 years or so, fraternal polyandry would keep birth rates lower because not everyone is having kids concurrently. Secondly, something you may not have thought of is that this approach, it prevents the breakup of family farms. Here in Limy, when the household head passes away, the household holdings, they stay together as a cooperative unit. In the US, we might split up our inheritance and property and then continue along on our own distinct paths as siblings. But here among the Limy, the inheritance stays intact as a whole. And that's a good thing because these lands are so difficult to farm that if 3 brothers split up their household fields to raise separate families, none of them could do it. It's all or one here among the Limy. And put that way, frankly, fraternal polyandry is a beautiful expression of humanity and the strength of this thing we call family. So now, we have just a little more time to do one more virtual research mission. And for this one, we're off to Venezuela to visit the Bari people who live in Amazonia. Here, our mission is to answer the question, how can it be that some children in the Amazon reportedly have multiple biological fathers? Now, the idea of multiple dads, that's not such a big deal, right? I mean, we've had stepfathers and adoptive fathers for ages. That's normal. But when it comes to multiple biological fathers, few of us believe that we actually have more than one biological father, right? Well, I know a place where that just isn't the case. Let's go visit a Bari community along the Amazon to figure out this 2 biological father thing. Now, when we arrive, we meet up with Stephen Beckerman, who spent decades visiting and studying the Bari. He explains that we're visiting with an indigenous group who fish, hunt, and they even grow manioc and bananas. We sit on a woven grass mat as a few elders sit in their hammocks, ready to talk with us about multiple or partible paternity. Now, because Beckerman is here and because he's already earned the trust of our hosts, we can get right to the point. And when we ask the elders if some Bari people have more than one father, they laugh with wide smiles and say, of course they do. When we asked how that was possible, they clearly explained that for a Bari child to be born, a single insemination was not ample enough, and that healthy newborns required what they called multiple sperm washings. So, biological parents will likely continue to fertilize their preborn baby, and it's common that a second male will provide secondary so-called washes. They clarified that it is important for a husband and wife to handle the very first fertilization, but then bringing in a second father is generally seen as a great strategy to raise a child and build a family. But when we ask why, when we push on, they keep with the multiple washes of sperm idea. And they say sometimes they simply don't want to wear out their husbands. But what else is going on here? I mean, biologically, we cannot rationally adopt their concept of partible paternity. The idea of multiple biological dads clearly violates everything we've been taught about how babies are born. But with our anthropological lens and mission, we can see some terrific reasons for this cultural idea in practice. Beckerman, he explains that the Bari have long suffered from attacks and raids that sometimes decimate entire communities. The Bari themselves are a peaceful group, but since the arrival of the conquistadors in the 16th century, generations of Bari people have been stricken with massacres and other attacks from outsiders. In the 1940s and 50s, for example, regional cattle ranchers, they regularly massacred Bari villages in a campaign to claim their land. And in the 21st century, it's oil and coal companies who are maneuvering to seize these same lands. The point is, they're adapted to a life of recurring attacks and stress. Beckerman, He interviewed 897 Bari women who reported on over 900 pregnancies. The results, they're illuminating. But the short of it is that women have an average of 8 pregnancies, but stillbirth and infant mortality rates were actually quite high. And unlike all other arrangements, women who bring in a secondary father actually had lower incidence of stillbirths and miscarriages. It seems the additional support and food of a secondary father is a sure way to carry a pregnancy through to a successful birth. So I get it. Without microscopes or statistical mathematics, the Bari people figured out the same thing that Beckerman did with science and anthropology. Having a secondary father is, at least here amongst the Bari, a proven way to increase the likelihood that your child will survive into puberty. And through oral tradition, the Bari cultivated and carried forward this cultural knowledge through the idea of partible paternity. And they're not alone. There's actually indigenous groups with similar practices and beliefs across South America, India, and Papua New Guinea. And at worst, give them an F for the biology of human reproduction, but they still get the important question right. They know exactly what to do to increase their children's chances to make it to adulthood. And you know what? It works. So let's wrap up this cross-cultural exploration of family and kinship. Today, in remote parts of Tibet and Venezuela, we observed how kinship patterns and local ecology are functionally intertwined. The Limi of Tibet, they taught us that fraternal polyandry makes a heck of a lot of sense if you want to create a family and a society living with scarce arable land and other resources. And the Bari of Venezuela, they just showed us how partible paternity can actually exist despite that well-known fact that the fertilization of a human egg is definitely a singular event. Thank you, cultural relativity and kinship. People across the world think about and practice kinship in all kinds of different ways. And what the diversity of kinship systems across cultures tells us is that there really isn't a gold standard for how to do marriage or family. In fact, we've discovered the exact opposite. Our ecological resources and geography really can shape the way we successfully create and sustain our families. And there isn't one form of family that works for all socioeconomic and cultural contexts. Today, we saw compelling cross-cultural examples of how different cultures have different ideas about how to structure family. And our anthropological perspective enabled us to appreciate the functional logic that underlies these differences. Think about that. Anthropology gave us a fascinating glance into the lives of people who otherwise we wouldn't be thinking about or even relating to. And by helping us make sense of these practices that at first glance may seem rather odd, anthropology also enables us to find remarkable pathways that connect the cultures of the world.